Hey everyone, Coffee here to talk to you a little bit about variance in spin and goes. So the program I'm going to be using is called SwungSim. It's a free program. You can find it on 2+2. Just use Google. And it's a program that lets you simulate a fixed number of games played at certain win rates for spin and goes. So the way it works is you just put in all your inputs here and then you run it. So the basic inputs you're going to need are your win rate. You can also use chip EV as well. We'll talk about chip EV a little bit later. Number of simulations, that's essentially the precision of your simulation. The larger number of simulations, the more accurate your model will be in terms of predicting variance. Number of games per simulation, on the other hand, is the sample size that you want to examine. And then you just set your format that changes the rake and the payout structure. You can just make sure that that's all accurate. If you want to, you can include rake back. I'm not going to be worried about that. You can put in buy-ins or in winnings. I'm going to be using buy-ins as the measure, and I'm using 5% rake. These let you change the visuals, so you can play around with that for the graph. So let's look at the kind of variance that you might expect, and let's use a pretty big sample. So let's say over the course of 10,000 games, and we'll do 1,000 simulations. That's pretty reasonable. Let's take a look at the variance that you might encounter. So depending on how many simulations you put in and how many games, the model may take a little bit of time. I've just skipped over the loading. And this is the spread of results over 10,000 games. So of course there's going to be a bunch of outliers. These are the players who hit the jackpot and won it. You can play around with the graph height to be able to sort of include these or not. What I've done is I've used a really big graph height, and then it lets me scroll down and still see this section, just the part that's sort of more interesting. So what we can see from this is that, in general, most players, let's say 90% of players, won somewhere between -24 and 460 buy-ins. So that's a really big spread, right? That's close to 500 games. If we look at maybe even like a smaller spread, the middle, here we can see we've got top 70 and bottom 30. So this would be the middle 40%. So the middle 40%, the spread in buy-ins is between 117 and 307. So almost 200 buy-in spreads, 190. So that's the kind of variance. Even over 10,000 games, you're sort of expecting plus or minus 100 buy-ins as pretty common swings. You can see that there's a 1% of players lost almost 200 buy-ins over this 10,000 game sample. And this was just for reference, this was using a 36% win rate, which is about 2.6 ROI. So nothing huge, but also nothing super small. But then, of course, on the other hand, you have the 5% of players who won more than 547 buy-ins. So, and that's sort of how variance works in spin goes, is that the players who are over EV are often very, very over EV. But you're more often under EV, but not by as large margins, right? Like, you're not going to be 10,000 buy-ins under EV, but you can be 10,000 buy-ins above EV. So, after looking at this, I hope that you can be essentially convinced that results, dollar results in spin and goes are, first off, very high in variance, but also very poor predictors of future results. That is to say, if I play 10,000 spin and goes and I look at my buy-ins won, it's really not going to be telling me almost anything about my true win rate. And that's just because of this variance. There's just so much room where the buy-in result is just, very, very influenced by variance. And even if you use a larger setting, like even if we start looking at 20,000 games, there's still going to be a pretty huge amount of variance in terms of just how different results you can get. I'm just going to do this at 20,000 games to show you, and I'm just going to have it draw 10% of lines to draw quicker. And so it might miss some of the top ones, but you can see that, you know, even over 20,000 games, the spread in buy-ins won is still, like, while now it's pretty hard to be losing. You can see it's even you have to be in the bottom 5% to be winning less than 51 buy-ins over this period, right? There is that 1% that are losing like 100, but in general, it's extremely rare. But still, if we look at that middle 30%, like between the bottom 30 and the top 70% of players, the difference is still about 200 buy-ins. And so it's still like a spread of plus or minus 100 buy-ins. And of course, if we thought about this in terms of ROI, we would also have similar spreads. Obviously, as you get higher and higher sample, 200 buy-ins doesn't make as big a difference in ROI. But still, like, you know, the variance that you feel can still be quite large, even over quite large samples. So the text output is actually a great way to take a look at ROIs. So the text output gives you sort of the detailed statistics. It tells you that what percent of players had below certain ROIs, downswings greater than a certain amount. Downswing is defined top to bottom, so during any course of that 20,000 games. This is a bankroll low point. So this is how low, like, given that you start at 0, what's the lowest your bankroll ever hits over this 20,000 game sample? So this is what you want to use for bankroll management. This is your chance of losing a bankroll of a certain size. So if these players had, if this player had maybe 100 buy-in bankroll, you can see that this is sort of predicting that you're going to be losing your 100 buy-in bankroll more than 20% of the time, but less than 30. And it also gives a break-even stretch. So we can see here, like, this is 20,000 games. This is sort of the spread in ROIs. So 30% of players had an ROI below 1.51%. So that's 1% lower than their real ROI. And 70% of players had, 30% of players had ROI above 2.89. So again, like 30% of players had, that means 30% of players were above EV by a pretty large margin. And in fact, you can see 5% of players were 2%, or at least 2% over the expected ROI. So once you get to 20,000 games, the spreads are smaller, but still plus or minus 1% ROI is still a pretty huge deal. And so again, what you can see is that results are not a very great metric in spins for predicting the future. On the other hand, once you do sort of reach the future, like once you have a very, very large sample, let's say 100,000 games, that's when these results do start matching your expectation reasonably well. You'll still have the same pattern where so the average player is a little bit under EV, just because the players who are over EV are very over EV. But if we look now, this is the ROI spreads. So now the ROI, you can see, is just much more clustered around that 2.5%. You can see now the 30% of players are below 1.87, but it's extremely rare to have a player below 1% at this point. So you get to that long term, but it does take a very long time to start seeing this. Which is why, again, like, you want to do a good job of predicting the future to know, you know, what stakes you want to keep playing at, what kind of buy-ins you sort of expect to earn over a certain sample. So what can you do? So instead of using real results, what you want to use in Spin and Goes is called chip EV. And chip EV is pretty easy to figure out. and to compute, and I'll show you how to do that in PT4 after this. But chip EV is just equal to your all-in adjusted chips divided by, this is the total amount won over whatever sample of tournaments you played. And then you just want to divide that by number of tournaments. And that gives you your chip EV. This is the most common version of this that's used in Spin and Goes, just because it's so easy to compute. And you can get this off of any PT4 graph just by looking at your all-in equity-adjusted chips, looking at the total over any sample and dividing by tournaments. It's a really, really easy one. And given chip EV, you can get your EV ROI. So this is your best estimator of your true ROI in Spin and Goes. And to get that, you take your chip EV, that's this number, you divide it by 500, you add 1, so make sure you're not, this is separate, right? You're adding 1 to chip EV over 500. Don't add the 1 to the 500. And then once you have that number, you multiply it by 1 minus the rake in your specific tournament, and then you subtract 1. And that'll give you an answer in the form of a decimal. So if you want to get a percent, you multiply it by 100. On the other hand, if you want to figure out an expectation of how many buy-ins you would expect or how much money, you would take that decimal and multiply it by the number of games. That'll give you the number of buy-ins you expect to win, your EV buy-ins won. And if you multiply it by just by the buy-in size, you can get the amount of money you expect to win. And so this is by far the best. This is just really the only metric, but it's the best metric. A lot of people sometimes get confused by the all-in adjusted section of this. So what that means is it leaves all of the hands played exactly as you played them and gives you your chip results just as they were, except for the hands that go all in with cards to come. And hands that go all in with cards to come, it instead gives you your all-in expected amount. So you just your EV adjusted amount. So if you got it in as a 50-50, it gives you half the pot, rather than the result, which would give you the whole pot or none of the pot, depending on your luck. And so it's just a way of removing your all-in luck. It doesn't change anything else. It doesn't change anything about bluffing. It also doesn't change anything about like coolers. It doesn't remove getting coolered by aces when you have pocket kings, for instance. But it does remove all the all-in variance. And the other thing that this chip EV does is it also removes the multiplier variance in Spin and Goes. So this removes the fact that maybe you ran really bad in all of your high multipliers, but ran really good in your low multipliers. And so you ended up with, playing maybe a good game overall, but your actual ROI was quite low. You didn't win a lot of money because all of your winnings were at the low multipliers. Well, chip EV also gets rid of that because it treats every tournament the same. It just cares about how many chips you earn in every tournament. And so again, that's why this is what you want to be using to predict your future results. So with that being said, we've looked a little bit at at variance of dollar amounts, and you all can play around with SwongSim more to see more graphs, more sort of paths of how you can go. I think it's a great idea to try to do it with like smaller simulations, like do it with fewer simulations so you can kind of follow a path, just to understand like what possibilities variance can have in store for you, so that when things that you thought were unexpected happen, you can be a little bit more comforted by knowing that, well, it's all sort of normal in a sense, or you'll be a little bit better prepared. At least that's the idea. So play around with this. And again, for bankroll purposes, this is a great tool to estimate how good of a bankroll you have, because you can use you can predict your results. If you have a good estimator of your chip EV or win rate, you can use this bankroll low point to sort of estimate what your chance of going broke are, essentially, or having to move down in theory. So you can say, well, what if I take a 50 bind shot at the next level? What are the chances that I'll go broke over the course of 1,000 games? And this will give you that answer. So it's really useful for that. And again, I also can tell you about downswings you can expect over the course of certain samples. This was the 20,000 game sample. So you can see actually about half of players had a downswing greater than 263 binds over the 20,000 game sample. So you have to know that given this kind of ROI, which to be fair is on the low side for spin and goes. This is a pretty low ROI, but just whatever I plugged in. But in any case, given that ROI, you have to be prepared that there's a really good chance you're going to go on this kind of bind, this kind of downswing. But at the end of your 20,000 games, there's a really good chance you'll be earning more than this many binds. Probably hopefully around 2,000 or more binds. So that's why it's worth surviving these 200 bind downswings. So that's how you can look at these variances for your dollar results. But I did want to show you as well, before I forget, you can also, in SwongSim, you can put in percent win rates. And actually, if you are interested, you can get your expected win rate. So you could think chip EV win rate. That's just equal to your chip EV plus 500 divided by 1,500. But SwongSim does it for you. So if you're thinking in terms of chip EV, so let's say a very pretty common chip EV is something like 45, you can just use that, and it will input the correct percents below. So SwongSim also has a feature for looking at variance in chip EV as well. So what you want to do is you want to click into EV chip mode, and you want to put in your chips per game, and then you want to put in a standard deviation. So if you do some Google research on 2+2, there's at least one thread discussing what standard deviations look like in spins. The general consensus is something like 400 to 450, but it varies with play style and probably just variance as well in terms of the samples that people present. But note this caution. Actual chip EV distributions have skew that is not yet represented. So to me, skew sort of acts like extra variance or like extra standard deviation. So I prefer using a higher standard deviation for this than the real one to try to take into account the skew. So I use something like 500 standard deviation. I think it's a pretty reasonable approximation. It also happens to be one buy-in. So the idea is, on average, you sort of earn plus or minus one buy-ins worth of EV chips, which, an average spin and go, you probably don't earn that many, but there are spin and goes where you lose or earn more than one buy-in. And again, this model doesn't have all that skew. So I think this is a really good way of doing it. And so now if we do the same chip EV mode, we do the chip EV mode simulation on this 20,000 games, we can see how much better this is. So what SwongSim will now do is graph a bunch of chip EV lines. So this is having players play it, and then rather than showing you the graphs of their dollar results, this is showing you graphs of their chip EV results. So you can see, I should use a different graph height to make this better looking. But you can see how much lower, or how much more clustered together this sample is. The variance is quite a bit lower in terms of your chip EV. But there still is variance in your chip EV. But you can see at the end of your this is 10,000 games. Sorry, yeah, this is actually 10,000 games, not 20. My fault. You can see that the results lie in a pretty narrow band, sort of plus or minus 5 chip EV once you get to these kind of samples. Oh, this is 100,000 games. Sorry, I forgot. This is the giant sample. So once you have 100,000 games, your chip EV is going to be very, very stable. And so that means that it is a very good predictor, much better predictor than real results when you have really any sample. If we look at a smaller sample, so let's do something like 10,000 games. What we'll find is that there's still a pretty good spread in your ChipEV results. But again, it's significantly better than real results. So now we're getting that, basically all the results are within 10 ChipEV. But most players are sort of within 5 ChipEV, given the sample of 10,000. But you can see about 10% of the time you'll be at least 10 chips under. And this will vary, of course, with your chips per game and everything else. So once you get to these very large, these 10,000, 20,000 game samples, ChipEV tends to be quite a good predictor, although there's still some room to be reasonably below your true ChipEV. And again, there's skew added, so this isn't actually a perfect representation, and there's room to think about the fact that it could be even higher variance than this in theory. But let's drop this down to 1,000 games. This is like, I think, a sample that a lot of players would consider, relatively large. Like this is, this isn't quite. It's probably less than most players put in. Most grinders put in a month, but it's sort of like a small amount. It's like a reasonable amount to put in a month for a lot of players too. And you can see that now the spread is really quite large. You can see 10% of players are at least 20 ChipEV below their real ChipEV. And similarly, about 20 players are at least, or like can be like 20 ChipEV over, or 10 ChipEV over. 20% of players are, I guess 10% of players are like 20 chips. Yeah, 10% of players are 20 chips below EV, and like 10% are 20 chips over. So, but like most commonly, it's about 10%. 10 chip EV spread. So even over 1,000 games, you sort of have plus or minus at least 10 chip EV. Maybe it's closer to 15. And so the spreads are pretty big, and you can see that there's some pretty depressing possible graphs. You can see this player plays this 1,000 games and has barely winning chip EV, and that can happen again. I think with the skew, those results are actually a little bit more common, in fact. So when you start looking at smaller samples, chip EV still isn't a very good predictor, and so the truth is that like once you get to like small samples, like something like 100, there's just really no good way to use that 100 games to predict your future results. Because if you look at this sample of 100 games, and we have the same 45 chip EV, the results are really all over the place. From having a 10% chance of being negative 20 chip EV to 10% chance of having over 100. So using chip EV to measure the results of a session is really not a good idea. You're not going to get a really good feedback for how well your session went, even if your session is 100 games. So using chip EV on a day-to-day basis is not going to give you relevant information. What you want to use chip EV for is when you have larger samples. So what we saw is that like starts becoming kind of relevant at 1,000 games, but gets like really good at around 10,000 games, where results are actually still not very good. And so that's the point of chip EV, is once you have bigger samples, to be able to better judge your past performance and predict your future results. But unfortunately, when you have smaller samples, it will still be subject to variance because of all those things, coolers, card distribution, the way just ranges line up, the way you hit players, right? Like sometimes, and like there's other variants too that this isn't taking into account. In truth, our ROI won't be always the same, right? There'll be a variance in terms of like how you're playing, but there's also a variance in terms of like what players you play against. Some samples you'll be playing against more regulars, and some samples fewer regulars. Like some samples you'll just play against players you match up better against. That your standard strategy just does better against, and some samples you won't. So there's a lot of, I think, variance past this that you're not seeing. So I think in practice, again, like this chip EV result, I think, has even more spread to it, as do the ones at higher samples. So that's sort of the moral of this whole story, is that you want to be really careful with looking at your results in spin and goes for predicting the future. While once you get to the long runs, results can look very good, and it is actually quite hard to be losing over very large samples when you have a positive EV chips, a true chip win rate. But over smaller samples, you will encounter a lot of variance. And so you don't want to get too confused by small sample results. And that brings us to the last topic of this video, which is interpreting your PT4 graphs. So I've just loaded up a graph from a recent session I did streamed. So let's take a look at how we want to set up our graph in PT4 to give us the results that we want. So you want to make sure that you want a graph for tournaments. There's no reason in spin and goes to really do hands played or any of the other features. You want tournaments, that way you can do chip EV. And you want to put your winnings in chips. You can put it in prizes, right? But again, this graph gives you basically zero information, almost always. I've got some weird filtering set. Okay, so we got some graphs. So anyways, yeah, so prizes lets you know how you did, but really this graph is completely useless, right? The only relevant information in a prize graph is this last point. Otherwise, it's just fluff. It's just a pretty picture, and so it has no value as a tool for helping you make good decisions. It doesn't carry any valuable information other than the endpoint, and the endpoint is visible anyways in your in your balance on your website. So not super relevant. So what you want instead, again, is to put it into chip mode, and then here's the button you want to use, is display all in equity. So the other traps that you can fall into with trying to get useful information out of your graph are trying to use overlay net adjusted. This just doesn't work for spins. It's the best way to put it. It just has issues with spins. You just don't want to use it. You want to use all in equity and chips. Ignore this. It doesn't take into account multipliers, and it has other issues. So you want to do this. And lastly, some players also get confused by showdown, non-showdown winnings. So these, while there are some people who believe that these can be correlated with certain styles or certain, winning more or less. In general, showdown, non-showdown are actually not predictors of EV. You can have actions that have the same EVs, but drastically different results on blue line, red line, on these showdown, non-showdown results. And so what that ends up meaning is that they just don't predict EV. They don't measure EV. And so in that sense, they're pretty much useless. They don't really measure very much. They are results-based. They measure some weird aspect of your style, which it's actually a lot less straightforward than you think for figuring out like where your red line versus blue line winnings come from. I will say that in general, most spins players have slightly to moderately losing red lines and winning blue lines. Winning red line players tend to not have as good results on average, and significantly more variance. They'll have like more samples of very, very good results, but their average results will tend to be worse. At least that's been my experience when I've been watching different results of different players. Is in general, you do want to have a losing red line, winning blue line, but really you just don't want to look at this line because it doesn't really carry valuable information. valuable information is EV. So you want to do that. And then, coming back to the whole point of the discussion is that this graph also carries no meaning, right? This graph is only 62 games. So this chip EV graph, while you can get it in PT4, you really should only be getting it in PT4 every 2,000 games or so, right? Maybe 1,000 games or so. And in the meantime, this chip EV graph doesn't really give you any information because of all the variance. And so for the most part, that means you shouldn't look at it. This graph is just going to be a distraction. There's going to be samples that you feel like you played really well, but you end up with really bad results. And you won't actually know what the results are telling you, right? Like, because you can have played this sample of games and have really bad results, but your true chip EV was 45, which, maybe is really good. And so there's a lot of room where you don't want to get confused by, false feedback. You don't want to be told that you did bad job when really there's like no confidence behind that result, right? There's not enough sample to actually tell you did a bad job. And so really, I strongly recommend the best way to configure a graph is to right click on it, click configure graph, and change these to actually to thickness 0. And this way you won't get distracted by your graph over small samples. And when you do want to check your graph when you have larger samples, you can just right click on it, change the thickness, and take a look. But this way, you'll still know how many games there are, and you won't get distracted or tilted by your results. And, even good results can often be distracting or tilting, because again, like, they're not really good, right? Like, you don't know if they're actually based on your play or just based on random luck. Like, they basically are always based on random luck over a small sample. So this is how I recommend it. I think you should be checking a graph every 2 weeks, maybe every month. Again, generally looking for something like 1,000 games at least to check your sample, although something like 2,000 is better. And notice that you can do the same thing for your prize line. Right click, configure graph, and change this to 0 as well. Although this is a little bit less important, I'd say, because it doesn't really matter. I mean, I feel like it's a little harder to get tilted by like how you got somewhere, and often we still have to know our bankroll, especially if you're not staked just for purposes of bankroll management. But if you can avoid looking at your bankroll as well, that's again more information that isn't useful that you're hiding from yourself that could distract you, and that's a good thing. One tricky thing about this graph, if you have it in prizes, and if I put back these to be sort of the default way, if I have it in prizes and I still leave the display all in equity box checked, what you'll find is that there'll be 2 axes over here, 2 labels, dollars and chips. And what's going on is that this green line will still be results in dollars, and this yellow line will be chip EV in chips. And so there'll be 2 axes for that reason. Here, like, the chip EV will be down here, and it'll be 2,600 chips, while this is $1,800. So this can be really confusing to a lot of people. It'll look like their graph is doing really well, or they'll say they have a certain amount of dollar chip EV when this is not actually telling them that. So just be careful. If you're looking at all in equity, make sure to put it in chip EV mode to avoid this confusion. Again, this graph is not telling you, $1,650 of chip EV. It's telling you 2,600 chips in chip EV. So again, easy source of confusion. So just avoid it by using chip mode. And again, configure your graph to not show these numbers. All right, so I hope you all enjoyed the video and learned something about variance in spin and goes and how to interpret your results in order to better predict the future. As you can see, it's quite a tricky thing. and the variance can be quite large. That's why I really recommend you taking some time to play around with SwongSim a little bit more. Again, it's a free tool. I don't get anything. I'm not, I'm advertising it because I think it's a great tool to help you learn about variance. And I think it is worthwhile to play around with it just to have a grasp of the different variances you'll encounter, so that when you do encounter them, they feel a little bit more logical. They feel a little bit more like they make sense, because otherwise they can be very, very difficult to work through. If you're interested in more help with spin and goes and looking at more aspects of strategy and other topics, you should definitely check out Spin Legends. That's where I coach and do a lot of these kind of topics with students. Of course, I mostly do strategic content, not out-of-game variance bankroll management, but I use this approach of using different programs and using math to try to help build intuition, try to help us understand better the things that aren't intuitive in poker. Some things are intuitive, some things aren't. Knowing which ones aren't is very important. So if you're interested, check out Spin Legends. Spin Legends also provides backing so that you don't have to deal with bankroll management, which, if you've been playing around the SwongSim or watching this video, you can see that for spin and goes in particular, dealing with bankroll management can be very, very hard because of the variance. So taking that element out can be a really, really big thing too, to help you work on your game and work on progressing through the levels without having to worry about that bankroll management aspect. So check out Spin Legends, and best of luck to everyone. I hope you all hit big multipliers and go through some great patches of variance.